Good morning. My name is Arnold Blackstar, and I'll be moderating today's session. Today's session is a follow-up to the International Water Summit that was held in St. Paul, Minnesota a few months ago. And we're going to first start off by introducing our panelists today. So to my left, and then we'll continue onwards.
Mitakuyapi, Tachanka Luta we miexto, Sicangu Lakota Hamachana Rosebud, South Dakota, and Mataha. Le Taku Mni Ki Wakan Co-Convener Lakapikte. Chale Taku he Dakwe he Chunkumpiki he, Ho he Wopila Tanka he Chaksto. Cha Dayanya Hipiki he Wopila. Good morning. My name is Nancy Bordeaux. I am a Sicangu Lakota from Rosebud, South Dakota. We are here to talk about the Mni Ki Wakan Water Summit and also the Decade of Water with the UN and the partnerships that we can create from this panel discussion. Thank you.
How matakiapi Diane Wachian Capello, Wakiyan Machiapi, Sicangu Lakota Tama Kochike Mata, Hetia Kan Hijigala, which Oti Mata, Mni Ki Wakan. How Wopla Tanka, my relatives. My name is Wakinyan LaPointe. I'm Sicangu Lakota.
Good morning, everybody. It's really such an honor to be here with my new friends on this panel. And my name is Leanne Burney, and I work for UN Water. And UN Water is the coordinating mechanism for the UN family on water and sanitation issues. And we were recently involved in the launch of the Water Action Decade. So looking forward to talking about these different decades and just to follow up on Nancy's point, how we can explore partnerships.
Thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. And so I'll be asking you a series of questions, and if you can respond to the questions in terms of the decade action for water. So the first question is, what are the goals and actions under the Water Action Decade and Mni Ki Wakan?
Matakiapi. The Mni Ki Wakan World Indigenous Peoples Decade of Water Summit was launched July 31st to August 2nd, 2017. During that time, indigenous peoples and youth agreed upon some goals and a collective vision moving forward. The goals and collective vision involved creating opportunities for collaboration and partnership that would provide the potential for preservation, protection, and restoration of water globally, to provide a place where indigenous wisdom and collective knowledge could emerge new possibilities for a future that does not currently exist. The Mni Ki Wakan identifies the strengths and gifts of indigenous peoples, because too often indigenous peoples are overrepresented and destitute and underrepresented in areas of possibilities and strengths. And so the World Indigenous Peoples Decade of Water Summit is really an indigenous approach. It is not a UN approach. The indigenous approach identifies that 80% of the world's richest and rarest biodiversity rests on indigenous peoples' homelands. And that's no coincidence. Indigenous peoples have been in the business of nature-based approaches since time immemorial. They have the collective wisdom that is necessary now more than ever to protect these waterways, to protect the land. And so everything's interconnected. When we talk about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, every article is interrelated and interdependent upon water and interdependent upon Mother Earth. And so for indigenous peoples, their rights to water really expand upon what it means in addition to sanitation, in addition to clean water. Article 25 describes that indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their spiritual relationship with their traditional territories, water, and coastal seas. And so there's that spiritual and cultural relationship that we share with water. And it's from that the World Indigenous Peoples Decade of Water Summit emerges, that an indigenous approach starts culturally. And it's because of the cultural diversity that the rarest biodiversity was able to survive as long as it did where indigenous peoples live. And so it's a clear sign that when indigenous peoples' land rights are secured, there are higher storage rates of carbon and lower rates of deforestation. And so that's no coincidence. So the World Indigenous Peoples Decade of Water Summit really attempts to engage that collective knowledge and intelligence and help to develop those approaches and initiatives by indigenous peoples using their gifts for the benefit of water and all life. So we really call on UN agencies to begin to cooperate and partner and support the permanent forum on indigenous issues, indigenous peoples and youth, and organizations that are present here as we speak. And so, it's really important that Mni Ki Wakan World Indigenous Peoples Decade of Water Summit receives that support internationally, globally, as well as locally and regionally. And so we have been establishing regional coordinators, and by year 3, we will have established an organization that emerges from the recommendations of indigenous peoples from the Mni Ki Wakan Water Summit, as well as an indigenous peoples research center dedicated to the future of water.
And thank you very much for that. I'll ask Leanne the same question as well. If you could tell us more about what are the goals and actions under the Water Action Decade and the Mni Ki Wakan.
Sure. So thanks again for the floor. So the Water Action Decade was launched just this year on the 22nd of March here at the UN. And I would say the main objectives, the core objectives of the Water Action Decade are to advance sustainable development. The Sustainable Development Framework is a very important framework for the UN system that we work within, to energize the implementation of existing programs and projects, so that we hope that this is a platform that brings renewed recognition and energy, and also to mobilize action to achieve the 2030 agenda. So here at the UN, the 2030 agenda is really our guiding framework with its set of sustainable development goals. And that's really the framework within which we work. For UN Water, we are very focused on Sustainable Development Goal 6, which is the water and sanitation goal. And so we hope that this Water Action Decade will help advance implementation of Sustainable Development Goal 6. So I would say those are some of the broad objectives of the Water Action Decade. It was really adopted in the General Assembly by member states, and many member states supported the resolution that called for the Water Action Decade, showing the strong support among member states for water issues. So this is growing in importance on the political agenda, the recognition of water, since it is such a, as my colleague said, it's such a critical and crucial issue, and so cross-cutting among across all of the 2030 agenda. So I think I might leave it at that, but maybe I'll take this opportunity to mention at the launch of the Water Action Decade, which was just a couple of weeks ago, I would say the star speaker was Autumn Pelletier, and she is part of the Wakinyan First Nation in Northern Ontario, and she's a young woman, or young girl, and she spoke so beautifully and so eloquently about her spiritual connection to water, And it really was a moving point in the program. And so perhaps in some ways, as we're looking for links, we could think of Autumn and maybe how she could be part of both of these efforts.
Thank you for that. It's really clear that the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are tied to the Decade Action of Water that is from 2018 to 2028. The Sustainable Development Action Plan or Framework is from 2015 to 2030 window. And in Sustainable Development Goal number 13 talks about climate action, and as well as number 14, it talks about life below water. So it's really clear that the actions are geared towards that the idea that life is water and water is in fact life. And thank you. So the next question I have for the both of you is, what are the parallels between the two or points of intersection to you?
So I think it's important to acknowledge and recognize the voices of Indigenous peoples globally. Autumn Paltier will also be speaking at the 2018 Mni Ki Wakan World Indigenous Peoples Decade of Water Summit. I spoke very intimately with them about the process and the vision for this water summit. And, you know, they really see that need for a world indigenous approach to water, not just as individuals, but collectively and globally. All too often, Indigenous peoples are spoken for or rendered as a footnote or an afterthought in approaches when concerning their rights. All too often, we're painted in terms of deficits and rather than our strengths and possibilities. And our record shows otherwise. Indigenous peoples are the oldest nations of the world and therefore the eldest nations. And that is why they have proven themselves as the most sustainable time and again. They maintain those approaches and relationships with Mother Earth, water, and all life that can help to emerge new possibilities for the broader community in their thinking, decision-making at all levels. And so there are more Indigenous youth out there and peoples who have voices on water who are experiencing tremendous issues that are hard for us to imagine. There are Indigenous peoples whose riverways are being contaminated, whose sea levels have risen and have displaced their communities, whose drinking water is no longer safe to drink, whose issues come as a result of states' failure to establish remedial policies and policies that are responsive to the Indigenous rights as described in a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But Indigenous peoples have time and again been calling for those kind of policies, those actions, those decisions. And so with the Mni Ki Wakan World Indigenous Peoples Decade of Water Summit, we are really establishing a genuine, sincere, and intimate international Indigenous community that has to voice its own approaches and designs for the future of water. And with that respect, we call on UN agencies and other world actors to support this global effort by, for, and with Indigenous peoples, to work with Indigenous peoples and not on Indigenous peoples. And so there's an approach here that must be recognized by United Nations agencies and world actors. And it's important because if we want to establish a sincere and genuine relationship, then our Mni Ki Wakan World Indigenous Peoples Decade of Water Summit presents that greatest opportunity to arrive at that possibility for a greater and higher form of collaboration, of partnership, and so on. And so we're here at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues where Indigenous peoples and youth convene globally. And that is something profound that must be, tapped into and engaged with, because there are all kinds of voices here on water. And here at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, we are not a footnote. We don't want to be an afterthought. We want to be heard. And so that's why we're here in the first place. And with that, we really call on those respectful approaches in partnering with Indigenous peoples and youth to no longer be a footnote. We want to be at the table and not on the menu.
Thank you for that comment. I'll also pose the same question to Leanne. So the question again is, what are the parallels between the Water Action Decade and Mni Ki Wakan?
Well, I think that there are definitely parallels and parallels that we can explore in greater depth. And obviously, both of these efforts are wanting to communicate in very clear terms the central importance of water to not only to humans, to ecosystems, to economies, and that if we don't protect our water resources, that we will not thrive and we will not achieve sustainable development. So clearly, I think our vision, there's a lot of similarities in the vision, and a decade of action on water is very much about reaching out and in a communication platform in many ways. So I think that there's definitely ways that we can join forces. I'm interested to know if there are any particular UN agencies or UN entities that you've engaged with thus far, and or if not, maybe which ones you think might be the most valuable for your efforts.
Oh, we engaged with UN Water and reached out to UNESCO. Those seem to be the agencies that are most responsive to Indigenous peoples, but there's a higher level of responsiveness that we are aiming for, to be those decision makers and to have direct say in the central decision-making processes, as well as the approaches that are being used to talk and to develop that future upon water, and to draw transformation from water. So with that regard, we want Indigenous peoples and youth here to be a part of those conversations. And so wherever those meetings are happening, wherever those decision-making processes are taking place, we must be present. That voice of Indigenous peoples must be present there to help in that design, because we have never relinquished our relationship with water or Mother Earth.
And thank you for that. So the final question I have for both of you is, what can be done together under the two initiatives to make right to water a reality for Indigenous people?
Across the world, Indigenous peoples are demanding and fighting for the rights of nature. They're fighting for the recognition of water's legal personality, of Mother Earth's legal personality. This has occurred in Ecuador in 2008 with the rights of Pachamama, and in Bolivia when they codified into its constitutions the law of Mother Earth. And in the United States, this movement has taken place from the ground up, from the inside out, where local ordinances recognize the legal personality of nature so that destructive, extractive industry projects would not have the potential to be able to destroy the livelihoods of these communities of Indigenous peoples. Recently, we've seen a spike in Indigenous efforts and campaigns to fight for their rights in the news, as we have all seen Standing Rock and other initiatives across the world to protect our sacred riverways, to protect the land. And so the rights of nature movement is one that has not yet been fully acknowledged or recognized by the Western systems or thinkers, where we have a relationship with Mother Earth and water, and that this can be understood and codified into the legal system. There's a new era of jurisprudence that is emerging, a new era of law that must be recognized, because law isn't stagnant. It should not stay the same. It should acknowledge that the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples presents greatest opportunities for transformation in law. The rights of indigenous peoples are linked to the water, to the land, and to all of the elements of life. And so they represent that transformation for law globally. But we need and must have that support from Western thinkers and from UN agencies, and to really have this grow on a global level. And so with the Mni Ki Wakan World Indigenous Peoples Decade of Water Summit that was originally announced here in 2016 at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, we sought to invite indigenous peoples, youth, global actors, and UN agencies that would support and continue to merge this new Mother Earth's rights, law, and protections. And so we really posited the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as central to that change and transformation. And it must be led by indigenous peoples. And so the creative initiatives and approaches and the collective wisdom and intelligence that emerges in Mni Ki Wakan will really go into the design of that future of water for a more sustainable future. And I think indigenous peoples really expound and expand what the human right to water means. And so that's something that needs to be paid attention to. So in addition to clean water and sanitation, indigenous peoples' human rights expanded to include their cultural and spiritual relationships with water, whether it be protecting their relationships with the whales in a coastal sea, or with the salmon that swim upstream, or with the riverways in which the canoes of indigenous peoples paddled and continue to paddle today. There is a relationship there that involves, in addition to sanitation and clean water, our relationship that occurs on the water and with the water. And so we act in accordance with water and Mother Earth. And that's the kind of laws we are striving for. Policies and laws that have a deepened regard for the sanctity and the sacredness of Mother Earth and water. And so as Mni Ki Wakan World Indigenous Peoples Decade of Water Summit, we will convene indigenous peoples increasingly throughout the next 9 years to develop upon the Mni Ki Wakan World Water Agenda, goals and visions, and the organization that emerges from that. And so we call on the global community to support this.
Thank you for the comments. And then I'll pose the same question to Leanne. So the question again is, what can be done under the two initiatives to make the right to water a reality for Indigenous peoples?
Well, thank you for that question. And I'll start out by saying I'm not a human rights expert. I know it's an extremely important field with many different actors working on human rights. When it comes to, maybe I'll just talk a little bit about UN water and the human right to water and sanitation. So as we know, the human right to water and sanitation has been recognized since 2010, when the resolution introduced by Bolivia actually was adopted, that recognized that this was a human right. And the Human Rights Council has appointed a special rapporteur on water and sanitation issues. So the current rapporteur is Leo Heller, and he is a member of UN Water in his capacity as the special rapporteur. So he brings to UN Water, which again is the coordinating mechanism across all water and sanitation issues, because there is not one UN agency that works on water. It's in many different agencies, including UNESCO. So this is a way that the human rights issues are brought to UN Water. We also have partners that are part of the UN Water family, and they are non-UN entities. So one UN Water partner is Waterlex, and their mission is to secure human rights to water and sanitation through law and policy reform. So again, these are, I'm just talking in very practical terms, these are potential venues for bringing human rights issues and particularly Indigenous human rights issues to the UN water conversation. So those are just two potential pathways. And I know that the Special Rapporteur has definitely focused in the past on specifically on Indigenous communities. So those are the potential ways. Again, UN water is very much focused on the Sustainable Development Goals, and so I was just doing a little bit of research before, and I don't know, maybe I would be interested to know your views on the Sustainable Development Goals, because potentially you might not see as much scope for action as you would like, but I know that several of the targets specifically mention Indigenous communities, 4.5 on education and 2.3 on agricultural productivity. One of the things that we're really interested in exploring in UN Water and within also the Water Action Decade are the intersections among the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we think about target 4.5, there's real synergy with target 6.1 and 6.2, which is on access to drinking water and access to basic sanitation. So there might be a way to have a conversation. I'm thinking about the agenda of your conference next year, and if you want to talk specifically about the Sustainable Development Goals, maybe that could be an interesting conversation to have. Around target 2.3 on agriculture, we know that 70% of fresh water withdrawals are used in the agricultural sector. So, and we have target 6.4 that looks at water scarcity. So there's a lot of growing concern about the growing demand for food and how thirsty the agricultural sector currently is, and again to have that maybe as part of the conversation. And obviously, Indigenous communities would have so much to bring to that conversation and so much knowledge to offer. So those are just a few very practical ideas, maybe too practical, I'm not sure, as to how we might find common territory.
Thank you for the comments, Leanne. I'll ask Wakinyan if you can respond to the questions that were posed under the Sustainable Development Goals. Again, that was under the United Nations Sustainable Development Framework, sort of from 2015 to 2030, that identified 17 goals with approximately 169 targets. So when you think about
exactly right.
Yeah, so when you think about the number of targets, so the issue is around how do you do data collection, how are Indigenous peoples involved, particularly around the right to water and how that impacts Indigenous peoples. So you've mentioned a couple examples today around how water impacts Indigenous peoples and the rights of Indigenous peoples. Another example I would give you is that in Canada, for example, currently today, the discussion is around the Kinder Morgan pipeline that's being proposed from Alberta into the coastlines of British Columbia, with the potential risks, impacts, and the approach now is that the government has taken the position that it is a national concern to build the pipeline so that the province of Alberta can take its oil to market into the Pacific area by building this pipeline. But the risk is there in terms of a pipeline bursting and impacting the waterways. Such action has already taken place a couple years ago in the province of Saskatchewan, where there was a pipeline that was built along the North Saskatchewan River, and there was an eruption, and there were several thousands of liters that poured into the river itself, impacting not only communities down the waterway, but also the food sources and the animals and plants that rely on that water system. So again, those are just some of the practical examples, as you mentioned earlier. So I'll go back to Wakinyan, if you could explain about sustainable development goals and how that can be more within the work that you're doing under the Mni Ki Wakan gathering coming up in 2018.
When I look at the Sustainable Development Goals, especially Goal Area 6 and a number of targets to reach that goal by 2030, those were agreed upon by member states and private actors. But for the Mni Ki Wakan World Indigenous Peoples Decade of Water Summit, we have approaches and initiatives that will emerge from that emerge directly from Indigenous peoples and youth to address water as an issue, but also water as an opportunity for transformation. So we want to improve upon the issues that are currently impacting Indigenous peoples and communities globally, but we also want to provide the space for transformation, for initiatives to create new systems that do not currently exist. So these approaches, initiatives that will arise from Mni Ki Wakan World Indigenous Peoples Decade of Water Summit are their own goals, are Indigenous peoples' goals. And so with that respect, we can continue this conversation and to really design a respectful approach on what that would mean in terms of Indigenous peoples' goals and Sustainable Development Agenda, Goal Area 6. And to see what a collaborative approach would look like, but also with respect to the rights of Indigenous peoples. And so the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples provides a framework for a partnership, a framework for a collaboration, and how Indigenous peoples would address the right to water. But going forward, in terms of research and data, our Water Summit will take a participatory research model in establishing a research center centered on the future of water, meaning that Indigenous peoples, instead of having researchers come into their communities and research them, Indigenous peoples in their respective communities will be in charge and in full control of their research with the help of principal researchers and facilitators to carry that out. And so every issue around water that impacts Indigenous peoples varies and is different depending on circumstances. And so that requires a nuanced and intimate approach, hence the participatory research model. And from that, Indigenous peoples were able to develop data that supports their respective and distinct approaches to water. And so the goals that emerged from the Mni Ki Wakan World Indigenous Peoples Decade of Water Summit and the collective vision that will increasingly grow throughout the 9 years will provide the greatest opportunity for non-Indigenous peoples and agencies to really expand their work and meet Indigenous peoples where they're at. And like I said, to work with Indigenous peoples and not on Indigenous peoples. And so the Mni Ki Wakan World Indigenous Peoples Decade of Water Summit is by, for, and with Indigenous peoples. And so, I think back to the March 22nd World Water Day report that was released, where it centered on nature-based approaches. But we think to Indigenous peoples, as Chair of UN Water Hong Bo said, Indigenous peoples embrace greener approaches. But I want to say this, that Indigenous peoples have been in the business for much longer than the UN system. They have been addressing these issues time and again since the first settler arrived. They have been developing upon the nature-based approaches since time immemorial. And so that makes Indigenous peoples and youth the foremost authority on nature-based approaches. But they must be respectfully approached in a way that is completely inclusive and respects them on equal footing, where they have full, prior, and informed consent, and they are consulted on a basis where all their rights are acknowledged as full human beings. But today we face issues where environmental protections for Indigenous rights are being rolled back by certain states, like at this present moment, the United States, Trump has rolled back over 20 environmental protections for water and land, which will prove very disastrous for the rights of indigenous peoples. But indigenous peoples continue to fight and continue to defend those rights. And so it's important to acknowledge who indigenous peoples are, that respectful relationship, but also that indigenous peoples represent the world's greatest opportunity for transformation. And so the Mni Ki Wakan World Indigenous Peoples Decade of Water Summit is centered on those kind of understandings, those principles and rights that are described in the drip. And so, you know, there's going to be a distinct and unique effort in terms of goals and a vision to Mni Ki Wakan. But that conversation can continue as to what that respectful framework for collaboration and partnership would mean.
Thank you for the comments. And again, I want to thank the both of you. So Nancy Bordeaux will close with a song for us. But I want to thank Leanne Burney from UN Water, and also Wakinyan LaPointe from Sicangu Lakota Nation, and also with the American Indian Movement West as part of the coordination for the Mni Ki Wakan, and their participation in the World Action Decade of Water, which is 2018 to 2028, as by resolution of the General Assembly of March of 2018. So I'll call upon Nancy.
I'm honored to be here today and speak to all the indigenous peoples of the world that come to the UN. It is not so much our work in water, but the most important piece is indigenous peoples coming collectively together to share their intelligence, to share their prayers. All of these efforts on water must be led by spirituality, by prayers of every indigenous group in the world. Together we come together to be able to share what we know about water from our respective regions. We are unique in that way, in how we pray, and how we sing, how we interact with water. Because the water has a spirit. She is a powerful spirit, and that water belongs to her. We must ask for permission all the time to get on her waters, whether it's in a boat, whether it's in a canoe, or whether to enter her water. We must always ask this permission. If we don't lead our water efforts this way, then what it will be is just work, reports, and all technical business. We must all come together because water is in danger, water is in peril. And that coming to the UN doesn't mean the UN is going to do something for us. We are the UN. When we leave the UN, we are the UN in our communities. When we come back together, we're much richer for that. For what we bring here, we bring from our communities. And that is something that we have to offer. We grew up around water. I paddled all the waterways of the Minnesota. And my boys, they're now adults, paddle the waterways of the Atlantic. And it's important because we have that relationship with water. Anytime you're paddling on water, canoeing on water, you know that water is life. Ni wichoni, ni wakan, ni ki pajuta. Water is life. Water is sacred. Water is medicine. Water has a spirit, and she is watching you. She has a good memory. She remembers all people, every person on this earth, for what they have done to her, for her. This song that I am going to sing is about water. And the song says, "Thank you, Water Nation. Thank you for the health and well-being. Thank you for this life. Thank you for the water so that we may live." ya hey yo, we hai ya hey yo. Ni o ya te, we chose ani maya kuelo, pila maya ye. O ya te ki, we choni te lo, pila unya piye, uni pik te lo hey. Mitaki o yasi.